Anything can happen when people head home for a trip. Hallmark would have you believe that you'll abandon your high-powered career in your new home city to fall in love with a Christmas tree farmer or hometown pastry chef. The CDC would remind you that transmission of contagious diseases increases in the winter when everyone heads indoors together and gets all cozy with one another. And Senior Airman Lozoria would, perhaps, remind you to support local small businesses, inclusive of your friendly neighborhood drug dealer. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. With 3 deaths in a row, it seems like it's time for a less lethal case. And in the spirit of a season filled with warmth and light, somehow an acid trip seems like exactly the right fit for this episode between major holidays. Senior Airman Miguel Lozoria worked with the 375th Healthcare Operations Squadron at Scott Air Force Base in Shiloh Valley Township, Illinois. For those, like myself, who are unfamiliar with the geography of Illinois, that puts Scott Air Force Base at about a 4.5-hour drive southwest of Chicago. And although it's in a different state, its easiest reference point is actually that it's 24 miles east of St. Louis, Missouri. Sometimes the bases have an interesting history, so I'm going to give a little bit of a backstory. The base, originally named Scott Field for training pilots in World War I, was named after Corporal Frank S. Scott, the first enlisted service member killed in an aviation crash. That crash was the result of an engine failure during his orientation flight. The airfield, much like modern military aircraft and air shows, was a huge draw for the locals. The local community welcomed the base and the newfangled aircraft. After all, planes had only been invented 14 years before the airfield was established. In the 1920s, Scott transformed into a lighter-than-air station, a blimp base. They added a large hydrogen plant, built an airship hangar 3 blocks long and 15 stories high, and welcomed the Army Balloon and Airship School. After the outbreak of World War II, Scott picked up where it left off as a training installation and welcomed the radio school and the operators and maintainers critical to the communications effort during the war. When Congress created the Air Force, the base transitioned and became an Air Force base. The squadrons they host have changed with the ebb and flow of technological advancement. Most recently, they added a handful of cybersecurity squadrons. But the local community remains very invested in the base, in a way that I haven't necessarily seen in other environments. I mention all that about how intertwined the base and community are because I've puzzled over the details of Lozoria's duty station, and I can't actually make any sense of it. Although he was assigned to the 375th Healthcare Operations Squadron, his place of duty, the place he showed up to work each morning, was an off-base civilian medical clinic named O'Fallon Medical Clinic. While Lozoria was in high school, he took a class in nursing, and that got him interested in medicine. When he joined the Air Force, he signed up as a medical technician. Scott Air Force Base was his first permanent duty station, his very first stop in his Air Force career. At O'Fallon Medical Clinic, Lozoria treated patients and taught new physicians about being in the military. But this is the first time I've encountered a service member attached to a civilian clinic off base, and I couldn't find much more detail about this kind of assignment or how exactly Lozoria treated patients. He hadn't been in the Air Force for very long, but it was mostly an unremarkable stint. He'd failed a fitness assessment and gotten reprimanded for it, but beyond that, his record was blemish-free. While he was stationed there at Scott Air Force Base, Lozoria took a trip back home to Texas. And while he was there, back in his hometown visiting his friends and his family, he scored lysergic acid diethylamide, also known as LSD. This is not the first opinion that I've run across that discusses LSD and its usage among service members. The first time I found one, I actually checked the date on it because I very genuinely believed it was an old-timey drug that, got phased out in the 1970s. It would appear that I am very wrong on that front. LSD is lab-created, but it's developed from a substance found in ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows in grain and hay. Ergotism, which affects those who eat that infected grain or hay, causes convulsions, spasms, hallucinations, crawling sensations on the skin, and generally erratic behavior. Ergotism has also been offered as one explanation for the absolute chaos of the Salem witch trials. And it sort of makes sense that the original accusers might have been on a terrible acid trip when they experienced their fits. They would scream, throw things, make peculiar sounds, and contort themselves into strange positions. They claimed to have visions of the witches tormenting them, along with other visual hallucinations replete with color. Nevertheless, if you watched the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and saw that chocolate riverboat scene and thought, sign me up, maybe you understand Lozoria's enthusiasm for his score. When he returned to Illinois from Texas, Lozoria talked to 2 of the other airmen stationed at the civilian clinic. He asked them if they wanted to take the LSD with him, to do it together and make it an experience. Initially, one said no, citing a fear of failing a urinalysis test. Lozoria reassured him the LSD would be out of his system in just a few days. Most drug panels didn't even screen for it, and it would clear from his bloodstream even sooner. Because of that reassurance, Lozoria's friend caved. He later described it as being coerced. One of Lozoria's co-workers and friends offered his on-base home, believing it would be a good and safe environment. So they put their heads together, and they landed on March 27th, 2021 for their trip. I like to imagine them pulling out their calendars to coordinate around other engagements. And it seems like that kind of had to happen because the host confirmed that his wife would be out of town. I famously have 2 fairly large gaps in my knowledge base. The first is in American geography. I quite literally was not in the country in 5th grade when seemingly everyone learns where exactly all the states that start with I's are. The second major knowledge gap is around drugs. I really don't know very much about them, and I often don't know what form a drug takes or how it's consumed, or the various effects of drugs. But even I know that LSD can have long-term effects. The big concerns are hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, persistent flashbacks long after the drug has cleared the system, and the other big scary is that LSD can trigger schizophrenia in those who are predisposed to the condition. And, just a quick reminder that LSD is illegal. And not just illegal in some states, like marijuana. It's illegal in all the states. An acid trip may hit as early as 20 minutes after consuming the drug, and can last anywhere from 6 to 15 hours. Returning to baseline can take up to 24 hours. A trip is generally described as seeing brighter colors, changing shapes, visual trails behind objects, and unusual patterns. Physiologically, it increases the blood pressure, the heart rate, and the body temperature. Nausea, dry mouth, shakiness, and insomnia are all common. A bad trip can cause people to feel scared and confused, or conjure terrifying hallucinations. Nevertheless, on March 27th, Lozoria loaded his contraband into his car, drove onto Scott Air Force Base, and arrived at his friend's home. There, he and his two friends consumed the LSD together. Both of his friends had apparently bad trips. They felt jumpy, panicked, and freaked out. Both required calming throughout the night. They had a very negative experience, and at one point the host called his wife, the wife who was out of town. The host was worried he was never going to see his family again, so he talked with his wife on the phone for 4 hours. His wife was upset. She left town and her husband called her freaking out while acid tripping. She told her friend, who notified security forces of their consumption. As it turns out, illicit drug slumber parties are one of those 2 yeses but only 1 no situations. In January 2022, Lozoria pled guilty to wrongful use of LSD and wrongful introduction of LSD onto Scott Air Force Base. Consistent with his plea, a judge sentenced him to 31 days of confinement, just 1 day over the minimum required for his plea deal, 60 days of hard labor without confinement, reduction from E4 to E1, a bad conduct discharge, and a reprimand. And while I thought LSD seemed like an old-timey relic of a bygone era, hard labor without confinement feels similarly situated. Hard labor without confinement is punishment in addition to the other duties which fall to a service member. As laid out by the Manual for Courts Martial, the longest sentence to hard labor without confinement a service member can receive is 90 days. The nature of the hard labor depends on the company commander. That company commander gets to decide what tasks the offender must undertake. That said, the company commander still has to operate inside the borders of what punishments pass constitutional muster. The commander can't inflict cruel or unusual punishment. That means no safety or health hazards. Some examples of hard labor service members have endured include lawn work or picking up garbage around the base. Which makes me think that maybe I sent the wrong message when I picked up detritus around Camp Courtney in Okinawa. Army regulations clarify that hard labor without confinement should be done in public view so that it can focus on punishment. And it doesn't even have to be something that works towards a useful goal. Filling and emptying sandbags counts. Lozoria appealed with a handful of allegations, including an improper sentencing argument that the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals disposed of pretty easily. My favorite issue on appeal is that Lozoria wanted the 3rd sentence of his reprimand stricken. Lozoria had never contested the language of the reprimand in any of his post-trial motions, which meant he didn't have a very good shot at success. The reprimand itself read, quote, "You are hereby reprimanded!" Not only was your judgment in this case exceptionally poor, your conduct was inexcusable and a disgrace to the Air Force. Your willingness to use lysergic acid diethylamide, parenthetical LSD, with your wingmen and bring LSD onto the installation put the entire base population at risk. As an airman, you have a personal responsibility and commitment to uphold Air Force standards even when no one is watching. This act has brought your integrity and credibility into question. Your behavior demonstrated a lack of self-control and is an extreme departure from Air Force core values. From this point forward, I expect your conduct to be above reproach, as nothing less will be tolerated. Legal beagles, it was really important to me that you knew the first sentence ended in an exclamation point. Lozoria wanted that third sentence struck because, as he claimed, it was inaccurate, inappropriate, and inflammatory. While I appreciate the alliteration, this wasn't the hill to die on. I don't know if he just wanted to take the spaghetti approach to his appeal by submitting a bunch of arguments to see what would stick. But unless he miraculously got put back in the Air Force as a result of his appeal, the letter of reprimand wouldn't really have very much of an effect on the rest of his life. The letter of reprimand would have been relied on in future promotions and screenings boards. They would have seen the exclamation point in everything the convening authority wrote. But Lozoria didn't get retained. He wasn't going to face future promotions or screening boards. Fighting over the sentence that a civilian employer may never see does feel a little bit like debating which song to fiddle while Rome burns. In his appellate briefs, Lozoria argued that the entry of judgment is the permanent record of his conviction, and that no reasonable reader, such as a future employer, could accurately integrate, quote, putting the entire base population at risk, with what Lozoria actually did. There was apparently nothing in the record to suggest that Lozoria and his friends even left the house while they were on their acid trip. But the thing that gets me is that if Lozoria was actually primarily concerned with what a future employer might read versus the future employer just knowing that he was convicted and what the crime was, making this argument on appeal and getting this kind of appellate opinion just makes the letter of reprimand visible to everyone who knows how to use Google. The part that he found inaccurate, inappropriate, and inflammatory was specifically that he put the entire base population at risk. The AFCCA declined to strike that sentence, citing first that the convening authority specifies the terms of the letter of reprimand, and second, Lozoria did endanger the base population. They concluded there was some likelihood of harm by Lozoria bringing LSD onto the base and consuming it in on-base housing, because an impaired user of LSD could affect people or property anywhere on the base. Presumably no one knew what kind of trip Lozoria and his friends would have, or what these men might do while tripping. If Lozoria's friends knew what kind of trips they were going to have, it's probably safe to assume they wouldn't have consumed the LSD. By extending that logic, presumably no one knew what kind of trip Lozoria and his friends would have, or what these men might do while tripping. The last 3 cases I've covered have all involved accidental death. So it would seem abundantly clear that lots of things can go wrong when someone is impaired or unfocused. The AFCCA made no changes as a result of Lozoria's appeal. As you may have noticed, I cut the Legal Beagle section down for today's episode so that I can take a few minutes to extend a profound thank you to each of you. When I hit publish on the first episode of Conduct Unbecoming a year ago, I was so nervous to tell people about the podcast. It's something I am deeply proud of, but that doesn't mean I was 100% confident waltzing into this. We have built the best little wolf pack here, and it seems like the exact right time to pull back the curtain and tell you all a little more about yourselves. Across the different platforms, Conduct Unbecoming has a regular audience of about 270 legal beagles. We've spent 736 minutes together, not including this episode, or just under 13 hours. I've recorded episodes in 3 states, but I'm far more impressed by how worldly you are. Outside the United States, the top 10 countries for listeners are South Africa, the UK, Nigeria, Australia, Japan, Sweden, South Korea, Canada, Germany, and France. Within the United States, the most common listening cities are Atlanta, New York City, San Diego, Denver, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Seattle, Baltimore, Charlotte, Dallas, and Boston. This year has brought so much change and so much growth, and I'm thankful for you. I'm grateful you've chosen to join me on this journey. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when I take up our first arson case. A little crime brulee. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.